Hello, everybody. This is Langston Clark here from the University of Texas at San Antonio. You will notice that I'm wearing burnt orange today. And the reason why I'm wearing burnt orange today is because I think we mentioned in the initial video between myself, future Dr. Brandon Kroons, and Dr. Alvin Logan that we're part of the same academic family that all sort of met up at the University of Texas at Austin. And so I think I think me and I think y'all are our little brother and sister in the grand scheme of things. Maybe not Brandon's little brother and sister because he's like the same generation as y'all, but me
Brandon's
and
our cousin, and Alvin and you are like my older brothers. So that's correct.
yes, I would say that. I would say that. Yeah, that might be true. And Jonathan is probably closer to Alvin and them than I am, but that's not what we came here to talk about. So, want to introduce to the class future Dr. AJ Newton and future Dr. Jonathan Howe, and they're going to talk to us a little bit about the representation or lack thereof representation of African Americans in leadership positions in sports. So we're not talking about necessarily on the field play, but in those other positions that have power and influence. And I would say in some ways more significant than on the playing field, because the average playing career of an NBA athlete or NFL athlete or whatever other professional athlete is very small compared to people who work on the business side of things. And so we'll begin by letting the future Dr. AJ Newton introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. Super excited to be here. I am just going to start a little bit with, how I even got involved with studying sport. When they ask you, what do you want to do the first couple of years of college, I wasn't like, I'm going to be a sport management professor and I'm going to be someone that engages in research. That did not happen until year 3. So my junior year of undergrad, I had just transferred from San Jose State to a junior college, had a little messy athletic career. I was a former women's basketball player, but once I got to Colorado State, I found myself, being around the coaches and in the environment that I needed to be in that was, valuing success in the same way. And during that time, I came across Dr. Albert Bimper in his infamous class, African Americans in Sport. It was the first time I even thought about the intersection of race and sport. It was the first time that I thought about my sport navigation, meaning from, why did my mom put me in sport at 3? And why was I playing competitive soccer, softball, and basketball from the ages of 9 to 16, all 3 sports? And so I was just really unpacking and not normalizing that, everyone else in this age category is doing the same thing because they weren't. And so it was a really powerful experience for me. But during that time in that class, I knowing my personality, I like to challenge people. I like to ask questions. And so Dr. Bimper saw that and took me under his wing. From there, I went to the University of Texas, where I was in a higher education program, specifically looking at the experiences of student athletes because that was so salient to my identity. But once leaving Texas, I found myself in a sport management program where I thought I wanted to study Black student athletes, but as I began to read widely and get more familiar with scholarship, I found myself looking at more so the business side and more so diversity, inclusion, and equity in sport organizations. And so that's now my research lane, my research area. I know we'll talk about it a little bit more, but I study how sport institutions and sport organizations remain intact and modify around diversity and inclusion. And so what that means is I'm utilizing theory like institutional theory, that's organizational institutionalism. And so I'm utilizing organizational concepts to better understand, what does it mean to have sport institutions evolve, maintain, and progress over time around diversity, inclusion, and equity.
And just to clarify, when AJ is talking about a higher education program, for those of you that don't know, there's a major in graduate school where you actually major in college. You major in learning about how colleges function, and that was her master's degree major. And so next, we want to talk to Brother Jonathan Howe. Tell us about your journey. Tell us about where you are, how you got there, and what you're studying.
Yes, so as AJ mentioned, happy to be here. I started out, my journey was sort of, more traditional aspirations. If you don't want to play sports, you always want to be like a sports agent or something like that. So that was sort of my aspiration starting out. I was an undergrad. I went to University of Texas for my undergrad and master's degree. But it wasn't until I got there that I've seen so many Black men and women, right, holding prestigious degrees, I should say, is what really got me into thinking about considering a PhD program moving forward. And so with that, I was able to also work with the football team on the equipment side at the University of Texas during my undergraduate and master's programs. And although I was on the equipment side, I sort of used that as a tool to navigate the college athletic space. And so I used that as a way to connect with the Black student athletes who were on the team. I used that to connect with then, who was the head coach, Charlie Strong. At the time was one of the few Black head coaches at the FBS level. I used it as a tool to basically navigate this athletic environment as we're going to be talking about today. And so that led me into some of my research and also my work with the Sweat Center at University of Texas, which at that time was known as Amory. So I got to work with them, and then also looking at the Black Student Athlete Summit really got me interested in the research aspect. So much so that I ended up writing a thesis during my master's program, looking at the experiences of African American assistant football coaches at the Division I level, and some of their experiences regarding the lack of representation, regarding the challenges that they face on the job, and the trouble moving up and ascending in the ranks of coaching. And so that's led me to my program right now. So I'm actually in the higher education and student affairs doctoral program, but I still focus my research on sport. And within that, I have two lines of research that I primarily focus. My first line being Black male student athlete identity and experiences within that identity. And so that's what I'm working on right now for my dissertation, utilizing different frameworks to examine identity within Black male student athletes. But then also within my second line, continuing like the work for my master's thesis and looking at racial diversity within athletic administration and then also within the coaching ranks. So I'm excited for the conversation that we have today.
Thank you both. I think AJ, I'm going to start with you, and Jonathan, feel free to jump in with your thoughts and opinions too. We see this summer, and I think it was this. Listen, it's interesting. The summer of 2020 and the summer of 2016 were very prominent summers for athletes' involvement in social movements. If I'm not mistaken, I believe summer 2016 was a year when LeBron, Melo, and Chris Paul stood up at the ESPYs and did their thing, talking about more than an athlete, talking about race and social justice issues. But the Black women didn't necessarily get the same platform that they did. But in many ways, the women in WNBA, people like Serena and others, are maybe more the first ones to speak. The first ones to talk about protesting and boycotting and things like that. So my question is, how do you see those protests for Black women translating into positions of power and authority and influence within professional sport organizations?
Yeah, great question. And so what we saw in 2016, the WNBA team out of Minnesota actually was the first to support Colin Kaepernick. They had just had a recent shooting at the time, and so they spoke up almost immediately, but that gets talked over. But what I think we're hopefully seeing, what we saw in the fall was that, or transitioning from the summer to the fall, was that when Black women intentionally organize and intentionally speak up, change happens. But we've always known this from a historical lens. The stories just aren't accounted for, or they're written out. And so we can even think of the civil rights movement, where, I'm just now learning of how prominent Black women were in the civil rights movement, but it wasn't written in the history books. And I hope with the contemporary landscape, we can see that the Atlanta Dream, who wore the Vote Warnock shirts this summer against Kelly Loeffler, their owner, who at the time was running for a Senate position, they changed that whole election. They literally did, because I'm not from Georgia. I'm not in Georgia. Georgia senators don't, typically get me going or something I'm interested in, but because they had their symbolic protest, I'm following the Georgia Senate race. And now I'm concerned with why we need to have a Democratic senator in the White House, what that means moving forward with Biden's agenda. And so they just brought attention to these issues in a unique way. And so with that attention that they bring to unique issues, when we're talking about Black women in leadership, which is one of my dissertation papers, we oftentimes forget that if we say in our scholarship sport organizations are sexist and are racist, then how do we position Black women to lead in these spaces while arguing that it's sexist and racist? How do their doubly marginalized identities make sense of that? How do they navigate that? How do they institute particularly with my scholarship, a diversity, inclusion, and equity agenda? And how are they leaders? And so I think we've become a lot more accustomed to Black women athletes leading during this segment, during this juncture, but Black women administration, particularly at the professional and collegiate ranks, we're still seeing these really exciting the first. We're having the first coach here, or we're having the first AD here, the first Black woman, Carla, to be a Power 5 AD. So we're still having those conversations at the same time.
Jonathan, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think just going off of what AJ said, I think we sometimes become surprised at what's going on with Black women, especially in regarding social justice and protesting for that and advocating for it, because they're not in the spotlight as much as our Black men are with their sports and things of that nature. Thinking about the WNBA and the typical viewership that they get and the time slots that they get and how they're televised and things of that nature is not equitable to how predominantly Black male sports are, marketed. And so oftentimes they're engaging in this work, but it's not being seen by the masses. And then what happened this summer, they're on a prominent platform right now. They have prominent time slots. People are getting to see them and engage more, which is really powerful, but people don't recognize that they've been doing this work all along. But now that they're getting more prominent time slots, people are engaging more with them. Their message is starting to be highlighted a little bit more, but they've been doing this work all along. But I think it's just that prominence and what is their visibility as compared to other sports and other athletes.
So I'm thinking about, y'all know this, right? All across the summer, every corporation, whatever, the Google, Netflix, on the streets in Austin, they had painted Black Lives Matter, different cities across the country. And everyone's talking about their commitment to this idea of Black Lives Mattering, a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'm just wondering, when it comes to sports, when it comes to the business side of things, whether that be professional or in big time collegiate sports, which is definitely big time billion-dollar business, do you all think that there's going to be an honest sort of opening of doors for Black men and women to take those leadership positions? Or was it just a momentary thing where people were just saying this for the recognition and not necessarily the representation or the redistribution of the resources that come with Black men and women being in these positions of power?
So I'll say this, again, my dissertation is connected to this exact issue. I have a solo piece that is conditionally accepted. So for those of you all on this call, that means that I wrote something and people critiqued it and revised it and gave suggestions, and they've now said, okay, we're gonna move it forward, but fix this. And so with that piece, I theorized that the institution, drawing upon institutional theory, that collegiate athletics as an institution, when it has its legitimacy questioned, that's how proper and appropriate it is within a macro level societal lens, they have to make institutional changes. And so I argued that the collegiate sports scandals that were occurring, as well as how BLM was informing those scandals, as well as Me Too, were all sociological macro level conditions aligning with the inequities that we've seen in sport. That would be gender inequity, paradoxical ideologies of collegiate athletics, and racial inequities. And those were all converging to question the legitimacy of intercollegiate athletics. And so what we saw this summer was essentially just a response from that. And I argued that the response of the institution having its legitimacy questioned would be athletic diversity and inclusion officers. Now, my 13. Since then,
AJ, you froze. My bad. I was saying you froze. So just kind of go back and start that sentence over, and then tell us again what you were saying.
Perfect. So I hopefully I ended with the response to institutions having their legitimacy question, I argued, was athletic diversity and inclusion officers. And so we saw a wave or an emergence of these positions this summer. And so because of what happened with Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, it was, I'm going to use the word shocking to see so many collegiate athletic departments all of a sudden want to address systemic racism, when in fact the whole model, for those of us that have a critical lens, is exploitive against Black male athletic labor or Black female athletic labor, depending on how you look at it. And so what we have here is an institution that is one, racialized, that now all of a sudden wants to address systemic racism, not in the institution, but broadly in society. And so that's extremely complex. And so, you know, the fix this summer with collegiate athletics was to post a statement on Twitter or post a vague statement that was partnering with Nike that didn't really say racism. It was like, let's all do better. Do better about what? We saw some departments come around and do some marches, again, aligning themselves with Black Lives Matter in 2020, but Black Lives Matter has been a movement since 2013. And there has been countless deaths since 2013 to 2020 that would fall under the same umbrella as George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And so this issue of legitimacy and having to respond, I think we're seeing not only sport, but other corporate entities have to grapple with that. When something happens that shakes us in some way as a society, we are putting pressures on institutions and organizations to make a response. And I'm concerned about that pressure because you don't know if it's substantive or symbolic. And it's hard to decipher until we actually see the action.
Yeah. Jonathan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so, and I know AJ has done some of this work in the past too, but then also arguing the legitimacy that is placed on those diversity, equity, inclusion officers within the athletic department. So how much power do you really have? Are you really giving me if you are giving me that title? And so that goes back to the point that was just made, like, is this symbolic or is this actually something that's going to allow me to have power, to have a say? Am I going to be at the senior level administrative meetings, or are you going to kick me out, right? I just sit in my office while all the discussions are going on. But for me, when you see what is played out, especially I'm talking about coaching hires and things of that nature, they don't align with the statements that were placed out or put out this summer, right? And so it's easy for an institution to say, oh yeah, we're going to do better. But if you look at specifically at the FBS level with college football, you know, it's a coaching carousel every year, right? And there's been, I think, one Black coach that's been hired, and there's been multiple Black coaches who were fired this season as well. And then when you look at the professional level, we talk about the NFL going all out, right? They were the ones who first, you know, blackballed Kaepernick, but then now Roger Goodell comes out, he sort of apologizes this summer. And then the first part of the season was just Black everything. They played the Black national anthem and all this stuff, right? To try to get some sort of, some credence, back with the Black community to say, okay, we're trying to fix this. But then you turn around and you look at the Black coaches who are in prominent coordinator positions who aren't getting hired to be a head coach. So when we talk about, are their statements or is their practice lining up with their statements? And that is no, and that's been consistently no. But then to argue, or I guess to add to AJ's point, when these institutions are being challenged, their legitimacy, I think there's always an immediate response. but it's more symbolic in nature, and then they can just ride the wave out. It's like, okay, well, it's almost been a year. Black Lives Matter is kind of cooling off right now. Things aren't quite as bad, so we can just keep going on with the normal operation.
I mean, and it was crazy this summer. Like, they had a task force put together by Lead One on diversity and inclusion. There were anti-racist policies across different conferences. I mean, it was just like, so y'all just really weren't doing any of this. And so I don't mean to be a critic, and I'm not hating on those individuals that have attained these positions, but to me, the socio-political context to which these positions were emerged, we have to question. I've had individuals say like, well, this was already in the making. I'm like, okay, it was already in the making, but it happened to drop 2 weeks after all the racial unrest and political divisiveness that we saw on television, we saw and experienced in our communities. And so there's more complexity to it. And so that's what, I'm trying to figure out. It's not just how are they leveraging DEI? It's also, does it take a certain type of actor? We've had CDO positions, which essentially is Chief Diversity Officer in higher education for decades. And yet across all three of our institutions, we consistently see issues of diversity and inclusion, issues with tenure and promotion with faculty of color, issues with Black students, Latinx students on campus, white supremacy. And so we're constantly in a state of trying to fix these systemic issues, but as we're noticing, they're circular and they keep coming back around. And so we can't think of for my work, we can't think of the ADIO position as a fix, but to me, it can be a positive marker from an organizational perspective. I'm arguing that at an institutional level, I'm not sure how much prowess they have.
So I think about, just to clarify, right? CDO, and I think you say EDO.
CDO is Chief Diversity Officer and typically we see that in higher education. I created the term ADIO, Athletic Diversity and Inclusion Officer. And so that's at the collegiate and professional organization. So select NBA teams and the NFL have an ADIO.
So I think about these positions, and I think for the students in the class, it's important because when you all are going into professional spaces, right? Many of you are taking these classes because you have a love for sports, and a lot of you, I don't think, will go into sports professions. But regardless, right, if you're in a sport profession or non-sport profession, organizations that you're working with are going to have a chief diversity officer. And I've benefited from chief diversity officers. Y'all know this. But on the other hand, I still kind of think, is the chief diversity officer in sport and also in the other aspects of society the sparring partner? And when I say the sparring partner, this is what I mean. On the outside, like Black folk, we think that we're fighting like the championship fight, right? Anytime there's an issue, you think you're fighting the championship fight. You're going to the leadership, the person that's going to make a difference. But what they do is they send out the sparring partner. And the sparring partner, has the same stance as the people with power. They got the same moves, the same technique, the same traditions, and they're supposed to be advocating for diversity and inclusion, but really they're the punching bag. So when an issue happens, you just punch on the sparring partner, but you never get to the person who makes the more significant decision in the way that the organization moves. And so it's been said that in any organization that the chief diversity officer should be the president or the CEO, or the person who's at the pinnacle position should assume the position of being the diversity, inclusion, equity person as well. So want to take a slight pivot, but still remain on this topic. Jonathan, I know that your work deals with identity, and AJ, I know that you're familiar with identity work as well. And I'm wondering if in your research, or just maybe not, if it's not in your research, what are your thoughts on how the things that are happening in society now impacting the identities of Black athletes, both male and female, at the collegiate and professional levels? And let me not add this extra question. Go ahead and answer that first, then I'll ask my follow-up.
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, no disrespect to Black male student athletes, but I think Black female student athletes have always shown at least more to be more in tune with their like Blackness and their racial identity, right? Within a lot of the work that they do. Not to say that Black male student athletes aren't Black enough or anything like that. But what we saw like with the summer, I actually wrote an op-ed about this. Like we saw racial identity sort of supersede athletic identity for a lot of Black student athletes in the wake of particularly the George Floyd murder. Not to say that, you know, Breonna Taylor or Ahmaud Arbery didn't really matter, but we didn't see the public outcry really until George Floyd. And so after that, that's when you saw, especially in these prominent sports such as football and basketball, because that's really money drives everything, and those are the heavy hitters. So when those student athletes start to mobilize, change will come. And so the events of this summer have started, you know, shifting that racial identity to supersede the athletic identity with, you know, which a long line of history has shown that especially Black athletes in these prominent sports, right, have the athletic identity foreclosure where they focus primarily on this athletic identity. But I think now there's an awareness that has been created and generated where they are focusing, you know, more on their racial identity in some aspects than they are their athletic identity, which is showing in their movement.
Yeah, and it's also showing in their actions. There were several prominent athletes this summer, women's volleyball players, football athletes, as well as basketball athletes who decided not to go to historically white institutions, and they committed to HBCUs because they're thinking about, you know I'm a 5-star athlete coming out of high school, and that my athletic prowess is going to benefit white institutions. So I'm just going to go to an HBCU because I already have the cachet. I'm already coming in, I'm already skilled enough, and I can still be successful in these institutions that have for decades been positioned as difficult to get out of or difficult to be seen in. And so we're seeing just, again, that issue of legitimacy. If these historically white institutions are having coaches who are making lackluster comments around Black death, or aren't discussing the systemic racism of Blackness, these athletes are, one, deciding that I'm not going to go there, or two, I'm going to go a totally different route that we haven't seen contemporaneously and go to an HBCU. And so again, that consciousness is totally different compared to my time when I played 6 years ago, as I was so focused on, like, I want to go to a historically white institution because the resources are better, the travel expenses, it feels like the whole experience is better in terms of athletic play per se. But what we're seeing is, because that racial identity is so much more salient right now, going to a HBCU, they're not seeing it as a downfall or at their as a deficit.
So it's almost like it's a shift to like what it's I feel like it's a practice of racial uplift. That when a 5-star athlete says, I'm going to a Black college, I'm doing this for the culture, I'm doing it for the community. And AJ, basically, I'm going to repeat what you said. It's like, I don't need the white school to get to where I need to go. And I have the latitude and the cachet, as you said, to like uplift a Black institution with my athletic ability. The reason why I asked the question around identity was because I'm really wondering is how do y'all are going to be professors. I'm teaching the African Americans in sport class. Dr. Crooms is teaching African Americans in sport class, and Dr. Logan is as well, race and sports, what have you. And I'm wondering, how do we use the momentum right now that is shifting identities more towards more racially salient identities to get student athletes to think about themselves as leaders in the leadership positions in athletics, and not just the player, but think of themselves in the leadership positions without losing their wokeness in the process?
I think that's tough because there's multiple levels to this, right? And I think, as AJ mentioned, some of the prominent athletes are now going to HBCUs, but I think also within this sort of shifting of awareness and identity, you start to see some of these Black student athletes who utilize their athletic identity as navigational capital to sort of maneuver through these systems and to use that to share their voice. So they use it as a platform, right, to speak out on things and to make some positive change. But I think from an academic standpoint, we are in a interesting position, especially, you know, once you have tenure, that you operate separately from this athletic institution. So you may have an opportunity to pull Black student athletes aside and to show them, you know, to try to gain their interest in other aspects of their life as opposed to athletics, because the coaches are going to do whatever they can to keep them in that facility as long as possible. And so we may have some pull where we can get those student athletes engaged in other activities, maybe engaged in other Black cultural experiences, right? So that they continue to, I guess, build up their wokeness per se, and so that they are more inclined and more motivated to utilize their athletic identity and sort of take back that power in which they are, you know, exploited for their athletic identity, but then take that power back, right, and use it to their advantage and use it to the advantage of the Black community.
Yeah, I think even with athletes involved in collegiate athletics and those that want to transition to the administrative side, we also got to think about where are the Black faces that they see at the moment. And so if they're typically housed in academic or student athlete support, and that's kind of what we're seeing them gravitate towards. I was a part of NCAA leadership seminars, and you know, the cohort that I was with back in 2016, they're all working in student athlete development. I'm not, you know, all, but all, right? Like 90% of them. And so if that's the lane that we're interested in, that's totally fine. But we're not seeing people go from director of student athlete development to the AD position. Like, that's not typically the jump that happens at the Division I level. Now, I'm not sure about Division II and Division III, but there's something about how representation informs how you perceive yourself, your futuristic version of self, navigating organizations and institutions. You know, I can even say I didn't see a lot of, there's not a lot of tenure track Black female professors in sport management, right? And so my perception of the field was largely influenced by these adverse experiences that I was hearing, like, oh, they don't accept your scholarship, or, oh, you got to do this different. And so, you know, when I can look at the couple that exist, you know, Dr. Walker at UMass Amherst, we have Dr. McDowell, and I'm talking about at the R1 level, there's just not enough. And so when you're trying to understand your next step in a career that you want to be in, sometimes we're limited by what we think we see, and it's because we're not fully understanding the landscape and why the conditions have been created to where I only see this or only going to a teaching institution as an option.
So I think there are some commonalities in the experiences that you all have had. Jonathan, I don't know how close you are to the AD at Ohio State. You're probably not very close to him because he's like in his own space, right? Gene is like, he's almost like a god. So for those of you who don't know, Gene Smith is the athletic director at Ohio State. And Ohio State is one of the, y'all know this, the bigger, more prominent athletic organizations probably in the country. And I say organizations, I don't just mean as a college, but like, I don't just mean like, I mean like across leagues, professional leagues and whatnot. And so he's been there probably over 20 years or close to 20 years. And then AJ, you have a close relationship with Dr. Bemper, who is a former student athlete, professional athlete who has made his way into an administrative role at a university. And so I'm wondering if you all can talk about how meaningful is it for student athletes to see those individuals, and how do you, if I'm a student athlete, or if I'm just a student, right? I don't have to be a student athlete, but I want to be a student who's working in an athletic space and leadership. How do I get to somebody like that to get them to be the mentor, or maybe even just get to see how their life evolves so that I could take that track?
Yeah, I think that's tough because some of them, like Gene, he's very approachable, and so I've interacted with him a few times. He's taken time to, you know, work with me and to answer any questions that I have. but also on the back end, he's been there for a while. He can do whatever he wants to, right? Well, you got to understand that some of these Black administrators who are in these senior level positions are constantly working, always have things to do, are advocating for other Black student athletes and things of that nature. So it's kind of a give and a take if you can get that access, and that mentorship comes from that. But sometimes there's so much burden placed on these Black senior level administrators when they're in those positions that they may not have the time to, and it comes off as sort of a lack of care, but they're just under so much pressure that it's hard to do so. But the representation overall is so impactful, regardless of that mentorship aspect. Just knowing that you have someone, you have a position that you can strive for, that you wouldn't see at these other locations is powerful in and of itself. But it becomes difficult because I've spoke to some of these senior level Black administrators who want to give more time, who want to be the mentors for their student athletes, but they're just so burdened with all the other stuff that it becomes difficult to do.
Yeah, what y'all both are alluding to is the cultural tax of being Black and being in power, and that, I'm sure Dr. Clark, in your role, feeling the need to be at events. I know I would, at UConn, attend Black culture events, and sometimes it was late. I didn't want to. Not that it wasn't a great event, but I'm looking around and I'm one of the few instructors on campus there. All the other, not that many at UConn, but the fact that that representation and support, I felt the need to fulfill that gap. And so I, don't have a lot of advice for what you were asking for, but I have been fortunate enough just to be looped in for being my authentic self. And so I've developed a close relationship with Dr. Bimper because I was an undergrad student popping off at a football player about equity, right? And so people will gravitate towards your organic energy that you give off. And so you just never know who's watching. That would be my first. But I also have developed some really meaningful relationships that have helped me on the job market with white people in charge. And so I'm not just looking to people of color to help me. I have mentors and professors and sponsors who are in the rooms where I can't, and they aren't Black. And so how are you also developing cross-racial relationships in a manner that, again, is meaningful and that they truly understand your unique plight, being that I'm a Black woman in sport management?
I also think, just to add to the point, is that when you are looking for an advocate, such as a Black administrator, right, come to them with something that you want. Come to them with a solution or an idea, right? Because in my experience, what I've seen, if they're not able to give you their time, they're at least going to advocate for you in ways that you will not be advocated for. And I'm thinking specifically at Ohio State, where our Black student athletes, both male and female, have prominent organizations, have been very active within the community, and they've had total backing from Gene, and they've had total backing from, we used to have a Black director of student services, student athletic services, and he has backed them financially as well, right, and has backed us when we're doing some research with them financially as well. So they will advocate for you in ways, just bring them solutions. They may not always be able to give their time, but they can advocate for you in ways that other people may not.
So here's a question, and I'm trying to take the vantage point of a college student. So AJ, I'm thinking about you as the college student athlete, and Jonathan, I'm thinking of you as just the regular college student who likes sports, okay, undergrad. And we know that relationships that get built in college can lead to job opportunities moving forward. So how can student athletes, Black student athletes and Black students or other students who aren't Black or whatever, be intentional about building relationships across that gap? Because a lot of times you don't see student athletes interacting with regular students, right? That are meaningful relationships beyond me just being a fan of you playing sports. Relationships that lead to job opportunities, businesses, entrepreneurship later on. What advice would you give to our students for that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just reflecting back on my time, and yes, I had meaningful relationships with students that weren't athletes, but I think for myself, and I'm sure for others, a part of the class, you're so focused in undergrad about building relationships upward that you feel like it's the person who's, your boss or people who are in higher positions of power that are going to advance your career forward. I totally underestimated the value of lateral and peer connections until I got to my master's program. And so I didn't do that well with it, but I did make meaningful connections with Black students in a social way. I just wasn't seeing them as individuals or a support network to advance my professional career. And so hopefully if y'all are in that frame of mind right now, that you make that pivot, because I can only imagine how much more beneficial my career could be, not solely as an academic, but getting more into industry and corporate spaces if I had made those more connections lateral in a professional sense.
Yeah, I think also just an awareness of how the Black student athlete is perceived on campus as well. And so in trying to create relationships, between just the normal student and the student athlete, right? Understand what their experiences are. Try not to treat them as an athlete, try to treat them as an individual, right? Is a way that we can sort of bridge those gaps. A lot of times people are gonna associate it with like-minded people, especially student athletes who are with their teammates constantly, right? They're going to class in the morning so that they can be ready for practice in the afternoon. So they don't have a lot of time to really mess around and create those connections. But I think it's just being intentional about getting to know each other from an individual level, from a career perspective, right? As opposed to just this athletic identity. I'm a fan of you as an athlete, right? And I think that will contribute greatly. I've seen a lot of partnerships, especially in my time working in football at UT. I've seen connections from student athletes, football players specifically, to normal students, and they're growing businesses together right now as we speak. And so I've seen that work effectively, and I've also seen it work not so much effectively. And so I think it's just being intentional about, how are you trying to cultivate that relationship? Are you cultivating that relationship as just I'm going to take, or am I giving something too? And I think that's important to recognize.
Thank you. I bring that up because relationships to me are pivotal to your ability to ascend to leadership positions. And if you're only relating to people in a narrow sense of your identity, right? If you're only relating to your peers as this is my friend in college as a college student, if you're only relating to your peers as a student athlete, I'm an athlete, this is somebody I'm trying to date and hook up with, right? Or not to say the student athletes are the ones who do this. I'm not trying to make them out to be, licentious or anything like that. But, we have to understand that people are complex and they won't be who they are right now, 10 years from now. And so if you interact with people with that understanding, you never know how it's going to benefit you. And I also think, because you all brought up like the taxing, right? People think that the Gene Smith, the athletic director at Ohio State, the Albert Bemper, who's, I don't know, some type of super administrator at Colorado State University, but was a former athletic director for diversity and inclusion at Colorado State. People think that that's the go-to person for access to power and influence. But the reality is it might be the person sitting next to you in class. And so you all shouldn't negate the possibilities of the people that you're actually in class with. Want to get to two more questions. One being, what do you all see as like real solutions for the diversification, specifically for Black folk in leadership positions in athletics, both on the business side and then also on the higher ed side?
I think one is just, it's really hard to do this, to separate the business side of college athletics, right? But we know that it is really dictated so much by money and by donors, boosters and things of that nature. And so it's really having someone in a prominent position to be an advocate despite the pushback that they're going to get. And I'm thinking specifically, like even at Texas, when Charlie Strong was hired, and the most prominent booster, Red McCombs, is saying, oh yeah, he's not fit to be a head coach. He could be a good coordinator somewhere, but not a head coach, right? When you're making those changes from a racial standpoint, you're going to have that pushback. And so I think trying to be sustainable in that is you got to have someone in a leadership position or the athletic director position or president position, right, that's going to be willing to sustain that pushback that you're going to get. Because it's inevitable. It's going to come regardless, one way or the other. And that pushback is going to come from withdrawal of millions of dollars in donations, right? So how can you sustain that? And unfortunately, try to navigate both sides of the situation. But then that leads to an issue of who are in those positions of power. And a lot of times they are white men who are not willing to take on that challenge per se. And so it's kind of a catch-22 because you have to have someone who's willing to make that change, but then they're going to be villainized. And so you saw what happened with the athletic director who was at Texas, who made the first 2 Black hires in prominent sports, right? He was out within a year after Shaka Smart was hired. I mean, he had some problems on different aspects as well, but he was made out to be the villain. And so you got to have leaders who are willing to take on that task and that role, right? But I think we have to also create pipelines that are meaningful for Black administrators. So as AJ mentioned, like a lot of times that we're relegated to student athlete support services role, where on the coaching aspect, we're relegated to all these peripheral positions that don't ascend up the ladder. So for example, on the football field, we're coaching running backs and receivers, and they usually the offensive line coach is the one who goes to an offensive coordinator and an offensive coordinator to a head coach, right? So we're not even starting in positions where we can ascend or positions that are known to ascend to those positions of power. And so it starts with building the intentional pipeline and having someone in those positions to make those tough decisions as well.
Yeah, I think just to build upon what Jonathan said, excellent commentary. I definitely agree with what he's talking about, which is addressing the structural dynamics. Given I'm more focused on collegiate athletics, I won't speak to professional sport as much, but we have to be honest about the structure that we're trying to change. We still have issues within our broader society that we can't figure out, housing discrimination, job discrimination. And so these issues of marginalization in sport aren't unique. It's not like this is only happening in sport. And so we're trying to change multiple institutions and a whole society. And so I think we need to be honest about what we're trying to change, but honest about how difficult that change is. I know it seems simple, let's just hire somebody, but I argue that I want Black administrators that are put in these positions to be put in the position to where we're handed batons to where we can continue running. If you're putting me in a position to where, maybe he'll be okay, kind of like Charlie Strong, had a whole lot of mess to clean up, had to change culture. We're rarely handed the baton like Ryan Day at OSU, who got it from Urban Meyer. Like, what a great setup. Like, you were handed the baton at a great time where there was already a culture of success. Athletes are already bought in. You have a strong recruiting pipeline. Typically, when we're seeing Black coaches, the program is in shambles, right? And we want them to go and fix it, and then we're mad when they don't fix it in 2.5, 3 years. And so I just don't think we're being honest about the conditions that we're putting Black administrators in. I honestly also think I can't even imagine the unique pressure to be a Black administrator because you have to be successful. There is no falling upward, like the coach from Texas Tech who was average his last year and then goes on to be the head coach of the Arizona Cardinals. Like, we don't see that with people of color, but specifically Black administrators and coaches. And so if we really want to change, we have to think about how sport organizations are racialized organizations, not just organizations with racialized experiences. What I mean by a racialized organization is the processes, the structures, the policies are institutionally racist. And so how are we going to advance individuals when that's the setup they're working within? And so that transparency needs to be addressed.
Thank you both. Last question is, what particular piece of advice or insights do you have for current college students right now who are thinking about taking, they will all be taking the next step out of college eventually. So what advice do you have for them?
What year are they right now?
I think we have a mix. So based upon what my students wrote in their introductions, a lot of them are seniors and upperclassmen. I think I have a I don't have any freshmen. So I think sophomores and seniors is what I have. As far as Brandon Crooms and Dr. Alvin Logan, I don't know what their makeup is.
Okay.
I think one right out the gate is just a challenge to, as we're talking about this lack of African Americans in leadership positions, whether that's coaching, whether that's administration, whatever the case is, right? And whatever your racial background is, right? The challenge is to, in every position that you have, try to create a just and equitable environment. And so that means taking a look at who's in the room and who's not in the room. In every position that you have, that means taking advantage of whatever privilege that you may have within that position to advocate for people who are not in the room as well. And so I think just one piece of advice, just to know your position, and also to leverage that for an equitable change. I know that's hard coming out, especially if you're just finishing an undergrad and you're trying to go into a position. I know that's tough starting at the bottom of the totem pole, but if you have that mindset of creating an equitable and just environment, you can start asking those questions, start to get get people's heads turning a little bit, and say, oh, well, why don't we have, a diverse workforce here in this situation, especially in sport? And then also within that will lead to creative ways and creative methods to diversify your sport organizations, whatever that case may be. You could be a ticket sales, right? But you can try to figure out creative ways to, say you're in baseball, you can try to find creative ways to attract Black fans to come buy tickets for your baseball event, right? So just having that critical mindset, right, of everything that we need to do needs to be equitable. And so just keeping that mindset throughout your career, I think will serve you well in the long run.
I would say, not just for those that want to go into sport, but just broadly, being a senior right now, be patient with the process. I remember coming out of undergrad and, feeling like I had to have it all figured out. And I'm comparing myself to people that are 10 years ahead of me in the career. Like, that's not, you can't measure things that aren't equal. And so whatever you're entering into, run that race. And don't be concerned about the next opportunity all the time, because you're going to miss the opportunities around you. I would also add something that has been successful in my academic career thus far is the fact that I've moved. I started off at Colorado State, have a really deep network there, currently teaching in the institution now. And, you can always go back to where you started. I then went to Texas, have a huge expansive network there. Now I'm at UConn, got that network. And so having these networks across the country has made the job opportunity and application process a little bit easier. I'm not gonna say it's any easier because it's a super competitive field, but because I have these networks, I'm not entering into interviews blind. That they know, hey, you're connected to Dr. Burton. Oh, wait, you know Dr. Moore at Texas. And oh, you were at Colorado State. Do you know so-and-so? And so I know some of us may be in relationships. I was in a relationship with my soon-to-be husband the whole time I've been in grad school. So that's about 5-6 years. And we didn't live together the whole time. And so that may seem crazy. We just now got to live with each other full time, but that sacrifice that I made for myself and the sacrifice he made for his own career was to spend that time apart, grind, and get what you need to get out of those years so we can come together and have more opportunities in the end. And so that may seem a little harsh, but it has just been something that has helped me professionally.
Thank you both. We appreciate you. And if I'm not being cheap, I'll send y'all a gift or something like that. I'll send y'all a little something. Appreciate y'all. Hey, it's a pleasure to see y'all grow and develop as scholars. Y'all was on here sharp. Let me stop.